Welcome to the Book Fair Podcast. My name is Anthony, and this show is all about children's literature and the freedom to read. This week, we have an interview with Alex Ritany, author of Maybe Tomorrow I'll Know. Next week, we will have another episode covering new book releases, as well as another interview on Friday. Make sure to follow the podcast wherever you are currently listening to stay up to date on the latest news in children's literature. Now, let's begin with this week's interview. Good morning, Alex. How are you doing today?
Not too bad. How about yourself?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for being here and, of course, for being generous with your time. Can you start us off just by introducing yourself for the audience and the book that we'll be discussing today?
Of course. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm Alex Ritany. I am a non-binary Canadian author. I wrote Maybe Tomorrow I'll Know, a young adult time loop novel with body swap and amnesia elements.
And when it comes to writing a time loop story with a body swap and amnesia components, typically when there is a time loop story, like in Groundhog's Day, the character comes in with an entire lifetime worth of knowledge. But in Maybe Tomorrow I'll Know, we are jumping in as the readers with just as much information as the main character has. Can you talk a little bit about the writing process in jumping in on that first page, that opening line of when the nightmare ended, and how that just sets the tone for the whole story?
Yeah. I mean, that first line was one of the first things that came to me in a book. It very rarely does a first line hit as the original inspiration. Usually it takes quite a lot of tinkering to get where I want to go. But I knew right away exactly where we are. It's the easiest way to drop in kind of in media res where all of a sudden something's going on. And to let the reader only know as much as our protagonist who knows nothing gives so much space and freedom in those initial chapters to build our surrounding and give us an understanding, and the panic and confusion that the character feels is much easier to resonate with when you all have the exact same information. So those early chapters were so fun to write. I actually wrote them all by hand and then typed them up, which is not usually part of my process. But it was such an exploratory first draft where I sat down and thought, okay, this character knows nothing and neither do I, and we'll get into it. And then it's almost still, even after edits, a linear discovery process in those opening chapters from what it first was.
Now, Alex, when you said you wrote those first few chapters by hand, was that a conscious decision, or did you just find yourself with inspiration and needed to jot it down quickly?
At first, I think I have a picture somewhere of my first paragraph, which is almost the same. There are a few tweaks that we made in edits. I had sat down just to kind of get that out because I think slower with pen and paper in a way that it creates a very much more intentional prose than when I'm just hammering stuff out at the keyboard. So I wrote that first paragraph and then thought, I think this may be one where I sit down and write the whole thing. And I actually set out to write the entire thing by hand. And it ended up getting a little bit too scattered because I'm not necessarily a linear writer. I tend to tell the story in whatever order it is occurring to me. And then in editing, stitch it back together into the order that a reader will need to see it. So it became too much of a mess to keep it all in a notebook. Uh, but the first probably, I want to say 20,000 words, I sat down with intention to write by hand and did. And it was a very rewarding experience to try something new.
And so the book opens with the audience right there with the character knowing absolutely nothing. And one of the first things that happens is when this character awakens to find themselves in a car crash and gets discovered by someone who lives in this small town they find themselves in. One of the first things that this character is aware of themselves is a name. And in reading the book, you kind of get into this idea of an unreliable narrator who knows literally nothing about themselves. Can you talk about what it was like giving our protagonist, Laurie, these little nuggets of his own information that he was able to convey to the reader throughout the story?
Yeah, well, it was so fun to play with the trope of the unreliable narrator where he has no choice but to be unreliable because he doesn't know anything. So It was a balancing act finding the right spots to drop new bits of information. I knew I wanted to be very conservative with that, at least in the first half, because so much of his story is him kind of pinwheeling, trying to find who he is without the context of a life. So finding bits and pieces. And I remember sitting there thinking, okay, how do I make his context for what he knows of the world, of like popular media, make sense so that he's not completely clueless. So that, he's sitting there thinking, I know about James Bond and I know about file folders. So he has all of this environmental awareness and absolutely no sense of certainty about himself, which I thought was a really fun and kind of jarring imbalance to deal with. So I think for the first half of the book, he's got a name and kind of that's it. He plays hockey. He knows he plays hockey. And so to find those things, name, which ends up being very significant, and then hockey, which is something he loves a lot. It's like we're dropping the really important stuff, and that's it.
And of course, as someone who lives in the United States, I have to ask: Is the inclusion of hockey a primarily Canadian affectation? Is that something that you felt you needed to include as as a Canadian author?
What's funny is it was one of those things where I sat with it after it was the fact that he played hockey was revealed to me in the moment as I was writing it, and I thought, okay, now I'm actually doing the stereotypical Canadian thing. I didn't set out to bring in hockey representation, and it just kind of happened, and I surrendered to it and went, okay. And then, months later, after having drafted it, and when the book was almost out, we had the heated rivalry took off as this Canadian hockey show, and my publicist was like, "This is awesome. We're gonna use the fact that this character plays hockey." And I was like, "Yeah, we'll use his 5 seconds of hockey time as a connection to something in the popular zeitgeist right now."
And so, at the beginning of the book, Laurie wakes up, finds himself in a mysterious place with. Interestingly, I think that this is probably the thing that sets this story apart from any particular time loop story. He wakes up in a body that he knows is not his, and that's one of the few pieces of information that we, the readers, get at the start of the book is that this is not his body. Can you talk a
Mhm.
little bit about the that can you talk a little bit about including that as kind of an inciting incident for this character and how that developed throughout the story?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was from the beginning. My goal setting out was to find a novel way to talk about what dysphoria feels like in a way that is accessible to people who've never experienced that before. Uh, and so, he wakes up in this body and is trying to navigate not knowing anything. And then is having the tactile experiences of what it feels like to be in a body that is unfamiliar or just wrong, where, his voice feels different than it feels like it should to him. And the way that he takes up space in the world feels different. And everybody around him, as he's experiencing this crisis, is perceiving him as a girl and gendering him as a girl, and he has no grounds on which to correct them. And I remember from really early on in my transition having that experience of feeling like I wasn't able to correct people because I wasn't presenting in any other way that would make it seem like the way they were gendering me was incorrect. So I was sitting there in that awkwardness, and I remember sitting with that later on, thinking about it. I had transitioned, and remembering that and trying to think of like, how do I describe that not only in a way that a cis person might clock that and recognize it, but also empathize with it. And it's not kind of a haha gotcha. I've tricked you into empathizing with the transgenderisms, but I really wanted to make that an accessible experience and to open that conversation and just maybe help somebody start thinking about it in a different way than they might have originally.
And that way, the way that the story unfolds and is exploring this dysphoria that Laurie feels, as you said, it is not intentionally saying, haha, I tricked you into reading a trans story, but um, it is an interesting thing to highlight, to say that one thing that I talk about quite a bit on this show is that art is inherently political. You really have a hard time putting in themes, ideas, anything without kind of making them agnostic of the context as the author of the work. Can you talk about in some ways that your own lived experiences worked their way into the story to kind of strengthen those themes of dysphoria?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it wasn't always a very personal story, and a lot of what he's experiencing, especially in those initial days of confusion, stem directly from my early transition and my experience of trying to uh, get acquainted with myself while also still consistently presenting to other people. And I had, in a way that Lori did not have, a the buffer of COVID, which was what had kickstarted my ability to sit with these things that I had been just ignoring for a long time, where all of a sudden you're not being perceived in the same way that you usually are. And sometimes you're not even being perceived at all. A lot of lockdown was being by yourself in your house. And I didn't have to go outside, and it let me think about myself and the space that I took up and the body that I was in a different way, uh, that kind of jarred me out of the routine and almost like willful blindness that I had been allowing to take over. So that sudden shift in perspective was a little bit of the inspiration for Maybe Tomorrow I'll Know. And then, Laurie has this uh, the body that he's in. He goes and is like discovering that this body belongs to a pastor's daughter, and the family is very conservative and has some, like religiously transphobic beliefs. Uh, and he experiences some degree of the same like stifling need to just be quiet that we see from Valerie, because we do get some perspectives from her in the book as well. And all of that was very, very personal to write. I actually drafted the book while I was estranged from my own parents for transition reasons. And we've since reconciled, and that's been a really beautiful thing. But that hadn't happened yet when I was drafting. And I was drafting it kind of as the heat was turning up politically. And it just felt so important to me to keep writing this book that I wish I'd been able to see when I was that age. So it's all a web. You can't disconnect from the environment and the setting. Not that I would want to, but even if I did, I couldn't.
Right. And you kind of segued perfectly into one of the next things I wanted to talk about, which is the way that the book is structured. Laurie is in this small town, is getting help from some of the people in the area around him. And then when he falls asleep, the clock resets. And after a couple of those, we get a couple of chapters through the perspective of the person that this body belongs to. And that's Valerie, as you said, has a religious family with a pastor as a father. Can you talk a little bit about creating Valerie as a character? Did you have an understanding of who she was going to be when you went into this, or did you start finding that out after establishing Laurie? Which one kind of came first? Did they come into existence together? How did that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, Lori definitely came first. I knew who Valerie was, as I was getting into the planning of the book. I knew that she was there, but I was actually probably 3/4 of the way through an initial draft before it occurred to me that it was necessary to have her perspective. And it was I almost always have this with a project where I'm I'm making my way, I'm motoring, and I know something is missing, and I'm just hoping that I'll find it through exploration. And then a light bulb, I have my eureka moment, and I get to sort of shift the project in a slightly different direction or add a new element. And Valerie's chapters were that for this project, where I wanted to talk about the different ways they, in the same body, take up completely different spaces and exist in completely different worlds. Is Laurie is stuck in her body, and then we learned fairly early on that all of the chapters that Valerie is at the header for take place the day before the loop. So she's navigating her own life, and it is a completely different storyline from what Laurie is dealing with on loop day, and he's piecing things together, but the reader actually gets a little bit more than he does through Valerie's eyes of the context of the people that are in her world that Laurie is like desperately looking for to see like is his own self connected to her. So getting the kind of insider scoop from Valerie turned the story into a little bit more of an engaging mystery to me.
Before we go a little further on Valerie, I want to reflect on some of the other characters that we get to meet. While Valerie has her own story and the readers are kind of piecing together the mystery of the day before the time loop itself, we also get to meet some characters in this town that Laurie finds himself in when he wakes up. Characters like Gideon, Ricky, and Tenley, who works at the local corner store. Can you talk a little bit about some of these characters and the role that they play in Laurie discovering this looping day that he is trapped in?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Gideon is the other half of the structure of this book as the kind stranger, where you were mentioning tropes earlier. It, he's falls into the role of the stranger who will help, and he exhibits that for Laurie over and over and over again. Who he just helps him completely selflessly with nothing to gain from it, and becomes a safe harbor, even though at the end of every loop he resets and forgets Laurie. Uh, so Gideon is kind of like a guidepost for Laurie of what he can expect. He becomes a constant. And similarly, Tenley at the corner store is sort of that first window for Laurie into seeing queerness in the world and understanding that at least among the people he's found himself in this loop, that is a non-issue and is a safe thing. Like Tenley is non-binary and is kind of referred to as a kind of parental figure, especially to Gideon, even though they are not biologically related at all. Where Tenley is the person who takes people in if they're in trouble, and to have that character that is the safe harbor. Well, both of these characters are the safe harbor, and they both have elements of queerness in them. I wanted Laurie to have his first encounters in the time loop with queerness be positive because he encounters some transphobia later on, and to have that first exposure and initial perspective to be that it is a, a less than an issue, that it is just a part of life was really important to me. And then there's Ricky, who sucks. He is kind of kind of like every small town guy I was ever friends with. And generally speaking, despite being harmless, has the kind of opposite energy of both of them of being a little bit more self-serving, and primarily interested in what he can get out of any given interaction. So, you have to have a little bit of balance for all the people who are saint-like and will help for no reason other than goodness and kindness. There's always going to be somebody who is not out to do those things, and Laurie had to encounter some of both.
And early on, when Laurie discovers that he is indeed stuck in a time loop, he finds his way to Valerie's house using a driver's license to get to the address. And there's a lot of foreshadowing between Laurie um, going through the belongings in the car that he wakes up in, and in the conversations with Valerie in the flashbacks. As we're towards the tail end of this interview, is there anything you'd like to tease about what may be the connection between these two characters?
Yeah, I mean, I I have found reader response to be varied wildly in terms of, uh, going into this book and instinctually understanding what it's about versus being surprised, sometimes pleasantly, I would say most times pleasantly, by the way that it all, comes together. And I think if you are the type of person who's reading this book because it's speaking to you on a personal level, it is not gonna take very much to figure out what's going on. And the big, I will put reveal in all quotes, was never intended to be a huge plot twist that leaves anybody gasping and shocked. It is more about the journey than anything else. Uh, and it was important to me to make that journey as insightful and vulnerable as possible so that when you get there, even if you knew, and a lot of people will know, it's it's still powerful and sets the stage for the story to play out from there.
Thank you. And the last thing that I want to do here is the final question that I always give to guests on the podcast. It's an open-ended question. It can give you a chance to get your final thoughts in, um, as well as just kind of reflect. And that is, Alex, how do you see yourself and the work that you do as a writer?
Mm. I see myself as debilitatingly earnest. It doesn't matter what genre I am writing in. There's always a part of me going, what are we talking about? Why is this important? What will this mean to somebody? And I said this earlier, but it is truly a guidepost for me in everything I do is, can I envision the version of me that needed this when I was younger? Do I think that that person or people like them are out there? And why is that important? So to me, being a writer is such a gift and a gateway because I get to connect with people that I would never otherwise meet. And I get to do my favorite thing in the world, which is tell stories. And those occasionally touch someone and will meet them where they're at in the right moment. And that is more than I know I could ever do just by existing in the world. So to be able to connect with readers through story the way that I was connected to as a kid, and also the way I wish I could have been connected to as a kid, is the greatest motivation in the world. And I am so grateful that I have the platform now to talk about things like this and that there is a receptive space in the publishing community and a receptive space within readers and that booksellers are interested in championing stories like this because I always first see myself as a storyteller and second as a community builder. And to be able to do that at the same time is a dream come true.
Thank you. That was an interview with Alex Ritany. His new book, Maybe Tomorrow I'll Know, is available now. To learn more about Alex and their work, you can go to aritney.com. If you appreciate the work being done on this show, there are a number of ways to show your support. First, you can like, comment, or follow wherever you are currently listening to help push the show out to new listeners. Second, you can follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky at BookFairPod. Lastly, you can follow the show on Patreon at patreon.com/thebookfair. Following is free, and there are no posts hidden behind a paywall. Of course, the best way to help the Book Fair podcast grow is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Thank you so very much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.